Hi, everybody. Professor Benelou here with a discussion of the topics that you can go over for your Unit 4 discussion board. I want to start out with Reaganomics. Reaganomics was the economic policy of Ronald Reagan. Reagan became president in January of 1981. And when he did, the economy was still suffering from inflation and slow economic growth. To increase the personal spending that every American had in their pockets, he instituted what would become known as Reaganomics. Reaganomics, the gist of it is if you cut the taxes for the wealthy and big business, the wealth will trickle down. Reagan was a big proponent of smaller government and felt that the middle class would benefit from more simplified tax codes. He cut about 41 billion dollars from the federal budget, much of that having to do with social programs. Supply side economics, this was the portion of Reaganomics where the belief was you cut the taxes for big business and the wealth would trickle down. Tax Equity and Responsibility Act is what you are analyzing if you analyze this primary document. It closed the tax loopholes and restricted benefits and pension plans. This was Reagan's way of generating revenue for the federal government without raising taxes. It helped out somewhat, but not enough. The gap between the rich and the poor continued to grow during Reagan's 8 years in office. He did not increase the minimum wage during his presidency, and federal funding for firefighters, policemen, and education were all cut during his time in office. Single mothers, households, and African American households saw the biggest decline during Reagan's time in office. And in 1984, Reagan further slashed the tax rates of the wealthy, causing an even larger federal deficit. Okay, the first Gulf War. This document that you're gonna analyze is the speech that President George H.W. Bush made before the United Nations General Assembly in October 1990. All right, August 2nd, 1990, 2 months prior to that, Iraqi forces invaded and took over Kuwait. Kuwait's a very oil-rich nation. President Bush demanded the withdrawal of Iraqi forces. The United States was the head of United Nations coalition forces during the first Gulf War. Keep that in mind. We had the support of the international community. Saudi Arabia was the base for United Nations coalition forces during the first Gulf War. And the Saudis accepted UN coalition forces into their country because they are also an oil-rich nation. And the fear was that if the Iraqis invaded and took over Kuwait, that they would be next. Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, dared to invade and take over Kuwait because the U.S. had previously been an ally of the Iraqis. Well, he miscalculated because we became involved. Coalition forces quickly liberated Kuwait and headed into Iraq. Even though coalition forces had won the war, Saddam Hussein remained in power. Many criticized former President George H.W. Bush for that. But when he stopped to think about it, okay, the Middle East has always been an unstable area of the world. If we had removed Saddam Hussein from power in 1991, we would have created a power vacuum in an unstable area of the world, making it even more so. President George H.W. Bush spoke before the United Nations General Assembly in October 1990. This speech occurred, like I said, nearly 2 months after the invasion of Kuwait. Bush condemned the Iraqi aggression and called on members of the United Nations to demand a return of Kuwait. He stated that the United Nations can aid nations to band together to prevent aggression and punish those responsible. Okay, the next topic you can go over is the rise of conservatism. Pat Buchanan, a conservative commentator, was a contender for the Republican nomination in 1992. Of course, he lost to President George H.W. Bush. August 17, 1992, Buchanan gave a speech supporting the re-election bid of President Bush at the Republican National Convention. In the speech, he discusses what he calls a culture war. What was the culture war he was talking about? What topics does he go over? He then states that George H.W. Bush is the right man to lead the nation through its difficulties. Last topic you may choose is the tear down this wall speech. This was a very famous speech that Reagan gave in June 1987 in front of the Berlin Wall. Remember, Reagan was known as the great communicator, and not for little reason. He was an amazing speech giver, and he was a trained actor, so that helped as well. During the speech, Reagan urged an end to the Cold War with democracy spreading to the nations under communist rule. And he emphasized the hardships that those living in East Berlin and East Germany had suffered since the wall had been built in 1961. The dismantling of the wall began in November of 1989 with the collapse of the communist government in East Germany. The economy in East Germany was on the decline. Soviet Premier Gorbachev urged the East Germans to impose economic reforms like he had in the Soviet Union. Many East Germans were flocking to embassies requesting to be led into West Germany. November 1989, East German leader Erich Honecker resigned and East Germans were let into West Germany. And those are the topics you may choose, my dear students. Please do not hesitate to contact me if you have any questions.